The air in the warehouse was thick with the scent of cardboard and dust, a faint hum of machinery reverberating off the concrete walls. At the far end of the sprawling facility, tucked behind a stack of crates, sat Elias Carver, the CEO of Carver Logistics. His usual tailored suit was replaced by a faded gray jumpsuit, his polished shoes swapped for scuffed work boots. A clipboard hung loosely in his hand, and a cheap name tag pinned to his chest read, "Sam, temp worker." No one paid him any mind. To the dozens of workers bustling around him, he was just another face in the endless churn of seasonal hires. Elias had built Carver Logistics into a regional powerhouse over the past decade, expanding from a single truck depot to a network of warehouses spanning 5 states. But lately, the numbers didn't add up. Revenue was steady, yet employee turnover was spiking, and customer complaints about delayed shipments were piling up. Reports from his managers painted a rosy picture, on-time deliveries, satisfied clients, but the data didn't lie. Something was rotting beneath the surface, and Elias needed to see it for himself. He'd chosen this warehouse in eastern Ohio for his undercover stint. It was one of the busiest hubs, handling shipments for major retailers, yet it had the highest rate of staff attrition. Elias had informed only his COO of the plan, instructing her to keep it quiet. He wanted raw, unfiltered truth, not a polished performance. So here he was, blending into the chaos, a shadow among the workers. The first few hours were grueling. Elias hauled boxes, stacked pallets, and swept debris from the loading docks. His muscles ached in ways his corner office had never demanded, but he kept his head down, observing. The warehouse buzzed with activity, forklifts whirring, radios crackling, workers shouting over the din, but there was a palpable tension beneath it all. Supervisors barked orders without context, and most of the staff moved like drones, their faces blank, their energy sapped. Then he noticed her. Near the sorting line, a woman in her late 40s worked alone, her hands moving with quiet precision. Her jumpsuit was frayed at the cuffs, and her dark hair, streaked with gray, was pulled into a tight bun. Her name tag read, Marisol, Picker. She didn't chat with the others or pause to stretch like the younger workers did. Instead, she sorted packages at a steady rhythm, her eyes fixed on the conveyor belt. Elias watched as she lifted a heavy box, wincing slightly but pushing through without complaint. No one seemed to notice her effort, not the supervisor pacing nearby, not the cluster of workers laughing by the water cooler. She was invisible. By midday, Elias's arms burned from lifting, and his back screamed for a break. He grabbed a bottle of water and headed for the break room, a cramped space with peeling paint and a flickering fluorescent light. That's when he saw her again. Marisol sat alone at a folding table, her shoulders hunched, her hands cradling a chipped mug. She stared at the table, her face etched with exhaustion. Then, softly, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders began to tremble. A muffled sob escaped her lips, quickly stifled as she pressed a hand to her mouth. Elias stopped in the doorway, his breath catching. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd come here expecting inefficiency, maybe some lazy workers coasting through their shifts. But this was something deeper. This was pain. Marisol had no idea he was watching, no idea that the man in the temp worker's uniform was the one who signed her paychecks. He stepped back silently, giving her space, his mind racing. A few minutes later, he entered the break room again, casual as ever. Marisol had composed herself, wiping her eyes with a napkin. "Rough day?" Elias asked, keeping his tone light as he sat across from her. She looked up, startled, then offered a faint smile. "You could say that. You're new, right?" "Yeah, first shift," he said, sipping his water. "Name's Sam." "Marisol," she replied, nodding. "Welcome to the grind." "Seems like you've been at it a while," he ventured, watching her carefully. She shrugged, her gaze dropping to her mug. 10 years. Longer than most stick around. Why stay? He asked, genuinely curious. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Bills don't pay themselves. And my son, he's in college now. First in the family. Can't let him down. She paused, then added softly, even if it's killing me. Before Elias could respond, the door swung open, and a supervisor, Vince, according to his badge, strode in. Break's over, Marisol. Lines backing up. Let's go. His tone was sharp, dismissive. Marisol nodded quickly, rising without a word. Vince glanced at Elias. You too, newbie. Move it. Elias bit back a retort and followed her out. As they returned to the floor, he watched Marisol dive back into her work, her movements mechanical but determined. Vince, meanwhile, disappeared into an office, leaving the crew to fend for themselves. Elias spent the rest of the shift taking mental notes, the disorganized inventory, the broken equipment no one bothered to fix, the way workers avoided eye contact with each other. But Marisol stayed with him most of all. Her quiet resilience, her hidden tears, they were a mirror reflecting everything he'd failed to see from his executive suite. That night, as he peeled off the jumpsuit in his hotel room, Elias couldn't shake the image of her crying alone. He'd built this company on the promise of opportunity, of lifting people up. Yet here was Marisol, breaking under the weight of a system he'd let drift off course. He couldn't fix it all in a day, but he could start. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd dig deeper. The next morning, Elias arrived before dawn, the warehouse still cloaked in shadow. He wanted to see the operation from the ground up, before the chaos of the day took hold. Clocking in as Sam, he lingered near the loading docks, watching the overnight crew hand off to the day shift. The transition was a mess, pallets left in disarray, paperwork scattered, workers grumbling about missing tools. No one seemed in charge. Vince rolled in an hour late, sipping coffee and barking at the crew to pick up the pace. Elias gritted his teeth. The man's apathy was a cancer spreading through the team. He decided to test the waters. Approaching Vince with a stack of mislabeled boxes, he asked, "Hey, these are marked for Cleveland, but the truck's headed to Pittsburgh. What's the protocol?" Vince barely glanced up from his phone. "Figure it out." "Not my problem." Elias raised an eyebrow but said nothing, hauling the boxes to the sorting line himself. That's where he found Marisol again, already at work, her hands a blur as she scanned barcodes. "Morning," he said, setting the boxes down. She nodded, offering a tired smile. "You're back. Most temps don't make it past day one." "Guess I'm stubborn," he said, grabbing a scanner to help. "What's with those boxes?" "Happens a lot." "More than it should," she admitted. "Inventory's a nightmare. Half the time, the system says we've got stuff we don't, or it's shipped to the wrong place. Customers complain, we get blamed. Who's supposed to fix it?" he pressed. She snorted softly. "Good question. Supervisors like Vince just yell at us to work faster. Doesn't solve anything." Elias filed that away. As the day wore on, he saw more cracks, forklifts out of service, forcing workers to haul loads by hand, a leaking roof dripping onto crates, a radio system so outdated it barely worked. The crew was stretched thin, and morale was non-existent. At one point, he overheard two younger workers plotting to call out sick the next day. "Why bother?" one muttered. "They don't care if we're here or not." By afternoon, Elias's frustration boiled over. He caught Vince chewing out a forklift operator for a minor delay, the man's face red with humiliation. When Vince stormed off, Elias approached the operator. "You okay?" The guy, Tony, shrugged. "Used to it. Vince rides everyone hard, but he's the first to slack off." Been here 6 months, seen 3 managers come and go. Nothing changes. Elias nodded, his resolve hardening. He spent the rest of the shift shadowing Marisol, asking subtle questions about the workflow. She knew the warehouse inside out, every shortcut, every glitch in the system. Yet her insights were ignored, her voice drowned out by the noise of dysfunction. During a lull, he found her outside, leaning against a wall, rubbing her wrists. "Long day?" he asked. "Long decade," she said with a dry laugh. "Hands are shot from all this lifting. Doctor says it's arthritis, but I can't stop." "Not yet." Elias frowned. "They don't give you lighter work?" "Asked once. Vince said if I can't handle it, there's the door. Need the insurance too bad to quit." She sighed. "My son's got 1 year left at college. After that, maybe I'll rest." Her determination stirred something in Elias. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting for something bigger. He wanted to tell her then, to rip off the disguise and promise change. But he held back. He needed more than words. He needed action. By day 3, Elias had seen enough. The warehouse was a house of cards, held together by people like Marisol while leaders like Vince let it crumble. He clocked in with a plan: confront the rot head-on. He started by testing Vince's limits, deliberately slowing his pace on the sorting line to see how long it took for a reaction. It didn't take long. "Pick it up, Sam." Vince snapped, storming over. "You're holding up the whole damn line." Elias straightened, meeting his gaze. "Line's slow because half the scanners are busted. Ever think of fixing them?" Vince's face darkened. "You don't get paid to think. Do your job or get out." Elias smirked inwardly. Checkmate. He returned to work, but the exchange fueled his fire. Mid-morning, he slipped into Vince's office under the pretense of delivering paperwork. The desk was a mess: half-eaten food, unfiled reports, a laptop open to a sports betting site. Elias snapped a photo with his phone. Evidence. Back on the floor, he watched Marisol handle a rush of orders alone, her face tight with pain. When a pallet collapsed nearby, spilling boxes, Vince yelled at her to clean it up. She obeyed silently, but Elias stepped in, lifting the heaviest pieces. "Shouldn't have to do this alone," he muttered. She glanced at him, surprised. "Thanks, Sam. Most people just walk by." "Not today," he said, his voice firm. That afternoon, he called a meeting. Not as Sam, but as Elias Carver. He texted his COO to send a team from headquarters, then walked to the center of the warehouse and clapped his hands. "Everyone, gather up." Workers shuffled over, confused. Vince swaggered out of his office, scowling. "What's this about?" Elias pulled off his cap, letting his real presence fill the room. "My name's Elias Carver. I own this company. Been working here as Sam to see how things really run." A stunned silence fell. Vince paled. Marisol's eyes widened. "I've seen a lot," Elias continued. "Broken equipment, ignored workers, a supervisor who'd rather sit than lead. That ends now. Vince, you're out. Pack up and go." Vince sputtered, "You can't." "I can," Elias cut in. "And I am." As security escorted Vince out, Elias turned to the crew. "This place is better than this. You deserve better. Starting today, we fix it, together." He locked eyes with Marisol. "Marisol, you've carried this warehouse for years. I'm promoting you to operations lead. You know this place better than anyone." Her jaw dropped. "Me? I'm just a picker." "You're more than that," he said. "You're the heart of this team. Say yes." After a beat, she nodded, tears brimming. "Yes. The crew erupted in applause, a spark of hope igniting. Elias smiled. The real work was just beginning. The next week was a whirlwind. Elias stayed on site, overseeing repairs, new scanners, fixed forklifts, a patched roof. He brought in trainers for Marisol, teaching her the ropes of leadership, but he trusted her instincts most of all. She took to the role with quiet strength, reorganizing the workflow, listening to the crew's ideas. Workers noticed the shift. Tony fixed a forklift himself, grinning as he tested it. The younger hires stopped slacking, inspired by Marisol's example. Elias met with each team, promising fair pay and better conditions. This isn't a one-off, he told them. This is the new standard. One evening, Marisol found him outside, watching the sunset. Why me? She asked. You could have picked anyone. Because you never gave up, he said. Even when no one saw you. That's what this company needs. She smiled, a weight lifting. My son called today. Said he's proud of me. First time I've felt that in a while. You should, Elias said. You're building something here, for him, for all of them. Months later, the warehouse thrived, shipments on time, turnover down, morale up. Marisol led with grace, and Elias rolled out the changes across every site. He never forgot that break room, those tears. They'd shown him what mattered, the people who carried the load. Together, they'd turned a crumbling operation into a beacon of possibility.